Good day and welcome to Big Bad Tech. I'm your instructor Jim Pytel, and today's topic of discussion is energy and power. Our objective is to introduce the two closely related concepts of energy and power. We'll discuss the concepts they represent, important differences between them, the units used to quantify these properties, and the means of calculating energy and power. First and foremost, energy is not power, and power is not energy. If you continue to frequent this channel, understand I am unusually firm about this distinction. So much so that one might say I'm a messianic jerk about it. It will be of tremendous service to keep this distinction in mind because a misunderstanding and misapplication of these two distinct yet closely related concepts is unforgivable. Although this lecture is introductory in nature, I am blatantly and emphatically telling you to pay attention, as energy and power represent central concepts for this lecture series, and we'll come back to discuss these concepts again and again and again. One of the most effective ways I've found to convey the distinction between energy and power is using the analogy of money. Money is energy. If you've got a lot of money, you can do a lot of things, like buy a car, buy a house, or pay a marching band to follow you around all day and play songs at your request. The same thing goes for energy. If you've got a lot of gas in your tank, a fully charged bank of batteries, or a reservoir full of impounded water, you can drive a long distance, light a couple lights in your cabin, or light up an entire city. How you get that money or energy is via one of two methods: less powerful or more powerful means. One, you could work a really poor paying job for a long time, or you could work a really well paying job for a short period of time and then just goof around and take up an expensive hobby like horse riding. If you take a look at the units, it all makes sense. Your pay rate is power, and power is expressed in dollars per hour or energy per unit time. The units make sense. To calculate how much money you've earned at the end of the week, multiply your pay rate by the number of hours you work. Dollars per hour times hour yields dollars. If you wish to calculate your pay rate following a task, one would manipulate the same equation to solve for pay rate. Take the sum of money you earned and divide it by the time it took you to earn it. Dollars divided by hours yields dollars per hour. Finally, if you wish to calculate the number of hours it would take to accumulate a certain amount of money, you would manipulate the same equation to solve for time, where dollars divided by dollars per hour yields hours. What we've created is a very simple three-variable relationship. The concept of money is placed at the apex of our pyramid, as it should be for all good capitalist society, with pay rate and time side by side below it. To solve for money, take pay rate and multiply it by time, because they are side by side. To solve for pay rate, take money and divide it by time because money is over time. Finally, to solve for time, take money and divide it by pay rate because money is over pay rate. This simple triangular three-variable relationship is very handy, and you'll find yourself using it over and over again for a number of different concepts, among them Ohm's law and Pascal's law, two concepts that respectively govern electrical and hydraulic systems, which we'll examine in great detail in the near future. Let's now tie our monetary analogy to our discussion of energy and power. As with money and pay rate, the prime distinction between energy and power is that of time. Energy is the amount of work put into a system, i.e., the amount of money you have in the bank. Energy can take many forms, among them mechanical, electrical, chemical, and thermal. Let's restrict ourselves to the analysis of mechanical energy right now, where energy is measured in units of joules, abbreviated with a capital J, where 1 joule is 1 newton of force expressed for a distance of 1 meter. Energy can be calculated as force times distance. For example, 10 newtons of force expressed for a distance of 3 meters means 30 newton meters or 30 joules has been expended. Power, in contrast, is pay rate. Power is how fast energy leaves or comes into a system, or the time rate consumption or generation of energy. Power is energy over time. The SI unit of power is a watt, abbreviated with a capital W, which is really 1 joule over 1 second, i.e. a unit of energy consumed or generated per unit time. The SI unit of time is the second, which hopefully doesn't necessitate explanation. These definitions and units imply an important relationship. If power is energy over time, energy is power times time. I should remind you that the law of conservation of energy states for any closed system, energy can neither be created nor destroyed and only changed into form. Therefore, the terms consumed and generated come attached with some important disclaimers. It It would be more appropriate to say that an electrical motor does not consume electrical energy, but rather converts electrical energy into rotating mechanical energy minus losses. Additionally, it would be more appropriate to say a wind turbine does not generate electrical energy, but rather converts the mechanical energy of moving air particles into electrical energy minus losses. Regardless, the distinction between energy being power expressed for a period of time and power being energy consumed or generated per unit of time still holds true. This important difference between energy and power bounces off the skulls of many people, and I consider it one of my highest responsibilities as an instructor to force it through their skulls with a repeated aggressive hammering. Power is energy per unit time, and energy is power times time. Graphically, we can express this relationship using our three-variable pyramid, with energy at the apex and power and time side by side forming the base. To solve for energy in units of joules, take power in units of watts and multiply by time in units of seconds. If a watt is a joule per second, units of seconds cancel, and we're left with energy in units of joules. To solve for power, take energy and divide it by time, because energy is over time. Units of joules over units of seconds yields joules per second, or a unit of watts. Finally, to solve for time, take energy and divide it by power. Units of joules divided by units of joules per second yields units of seconds. For those of you with a calculus background, you'll realize power is the differential or rate of change of energy over time, and energy would be the integral or area under the power curve. For the purposes of this lecture series, we'll mostly steer clear of differentials and integrals and restrict our analysis to the much simpler algebraic manipulations. Let's try a couple simple illustrated examples. Energy is power times time. Let's say you used a 100-watt device for a total of 3 minutes. 3 minutes is 180 seconds. This device would have consumed 100 watts or 100 joules per second times 180 seconds, or 18,000, or more appropriately, 18 kilojoules of energy. Power is energy over time. Let's say 40 newtons of force has been expressed at a distance of 5 meters. Energy is force times distance. 40 newtons times 5 meters equals 200 newton meters, or 200 joules of energy input into this system. Let's say it took 10 seconds to put the 200 joules into the system. If power is energy over time, this represents 200 joules per 10 seconds, or 20 watts of power. Finally, time is energy over power. Let's say a 500-watt heater has put 2,500 joules of energy, or more appropriately 2.5 kilojoules of heat energy into a system. If time is energy over power, this demonstrates that the heater has been working for a total of 5 seconds. The concepts and the units should make sense. One great way of checking your work for energy, power, and time calculations is to examine these relationships without numbers. If energy is power times time, if one had a device of fixed power and increased the time span it was used, the energy requirement should go up. Conversely, if one had a device of fixed power and decreased the span of time it was used, the energy requirement should go down. If your answers don't follow these observations, you are doing it wrong and you need to perform a tactical retreat and reassess your situation. Let's try a couple more illustrated examples. Consider a task that necessitates 500 newtons of force be expressed at a distance of 2 meters. Consider a second task, which necessitates 250 newtons of force be expressed at a longer distance of 4 meters. Which task requires more energy in joules to complete? Energy is force times distance. The first task necessitates 500 newtons of force be expressed at a distance of 2 meters. 500 newtons times 2 meters yields 1,000 newton meters, or 1,000 joules, or more appropriately, 1 kilojoule. Similarly, the second task necessitates 250 newtons of force be expressed at a distance of 4 meters. 250 newtons times 4 meters also yields 1,000 newton meters, or 1,000 joules, or more appropriately 1 kilojoules. These calculations imply both tasks necessitate the expenditure of equal amounts of energy, which, if you think about it, makes perfect sense. Which task would tire you out more, carrying twice the weight, half the distance, or carrying half the weight, twice the distance? Theoretically, these tasks would be equivalent. Let's now examine the various methods we could use to accomplish a task necessitating 1 kilojoule of energy, of which we have 3 options. Option 1, a 500-watt machine. Option 2, a human working at a moderate pace, capable of generating 100 watts of power. And Option 3, a 20-watt sloth. Which of these available options will accomplish the 1 kilojoule task in less time? It should be obvious that a 500-watt machine will be capable of delivering the required 1 kilojoule of energy in far less time, since its power rating, or energy per unit time it's capable of delivering, is much greater than the other 2 options. Calculations support this supposition. Time is energy divided by power. 1 kilojoule divided by 500 watts, or 500 joules per second, demonstrates the 500-watt machine is capable of delivering the necessary 1 kilojoule of energy in a span of 2 seconds. Let's examine the other less powerful options. Consider the 100-watt human. Time is energy divided by power. 1 kilojoule divided by 100 watts, or 100 joules per second, demonstrates the 100-watt human is capable of delivering the necessary 1 kilojoule of energy over a longer span of 10 seconds. Consider the 20-watt sloth. Time is energy divided by power. 1 kilojoule divided by 20 watts, or 20 joules per second, demonstrates the 20-watt sloth is capable of delivering the necessary 1 kilojoule of energy over a much longer span of 50 seconds. Compare and contrast these results. A more powerful device accomplished the same task in less time. A less powerful device accomplished the same task in more time. It makes sense. In keeping with this observation, consider the energy of a AAA battery and a 9mm bullet. Which do you think has more energy? Surprisingly, a typical AAA battery has much more energy than a 9mm bullet. Specifications may vary. However, a typical AAA battery might contain around 6,000 joules of energy, whereas a 9mm bullet, depending on your proximity to the muzzle, might contain only around 500 joules of energy. Gun nuts, chill out. I am well aware of the differences between full metal jacket, soft points, hollow points, and fragmentation and frangible variants and their associated lethality index and stopping power, but just go with this 500 joule figure for now. The difference between these two devices is obviously associated with their power, or their rate of energy transfer. Let's say the AAA battery delivers this energy over a long period of 1 hour, or 3,600 seconds, whereas the 9mm bullet delivers its packet of energy over a much more rapid time span. For the sake of argument, let's say the bullet does so over 100 milliseconds. Again, gun nuts, chill out. It's just an example problem in electronics class, not a technical discussion in a Bass Pro parking lot, so you have to forgive any ballistic inaccuracies in the interest of forward progress. Power is energy over time. For the AAA battery, it's capable of delivering 6,000 joules over 1 hour, or 60 minutes, or 3,600 seconds. This yields a relatively low power rating of roughly 1.7 joules per second, or 1.7 watts. A respectably large quantity of energy is slowly and steadily delivered over a long time. The battery would be a suitable means of powering a low-power device, like your calculator, for a long time. Let's now consider the 9mm bullet. It is capable of delivering 500 joules in 100 milliseconds. 500 joules over 100 milliseconds, or 0.1 seconds, yields a much higher power rating of 5,000 joules per second, or 5 kilowatts. No wonder bullets cause such trauma on impact. A packet of energy is delivered very quickly. This explains why it's a recommended practice to power your calculator with a AAA battery rather than shooting it, although at times I'm certain you are tempted to do so. Moving on, let's now examine other units commonly employed in the discussion of power and energy, namely the horsepower and the kilowatt hour. First, let's examine the horsepower. In addition to watts, power can also be quantified in units of horsepower, sometimes abbreviated as HP, where 1 horsepower equals 746 watts. In the U.S. customary system of units, a horsepower also equals 550 foot-pounds force per second. As antiquated as this unit may be, I still have a tendency to think in terms of horsepower, because it gives me an idea if one can stop a device with your hand, with 2 hands and a little sweating, or if something will just rip your balls out of your sockets if you ever get tangled up in it. Long story short, anything stronger than a horse could probably kill you, and even a quarter of a horse stands the reasonable chance of doing so if it kicks you in a critical portion of your anatomy. Let's try some basic unit conversions. Consider a quarter horsepower motor. In units of watts, this motor would have a power rating of 746 divided by 4, or 186.5 watts. Consider a motor that delivers 560 watts. In units of horsepower, this motor has a power rating of 560 over 746, or roughly 0.75 horsepower. Most likely, this is a 3/4 horsepower motor. Let's now try an energy, power, and time example necessitating some intermediate unit conversion. Consider a 2 horsepower motor being used for a span of 3 hours. How much energy in units of joules will it deliver? A 2 horsepower motor would have a power rating of 2 times 746 watts, or 1,492 watts, or roughly 1.5 kilowatts. 3 hours represents a span of 3 times 60 times 60, or 10,800 seconds. Energy is power times time. 1,492 watts times 10,800 seconds yields 16,113,600 joules, or roughly 16.1 megajoules. You'll note that for applications like this, joules are tiny, annoying, and unwieldy units. For this reason, numerous applications make use of a far more convenient unit of energy, the kilowatt hour. Pay special attention to the kilowatt hour, since in my experience it presents one of the biggest sources of confusion for those with difficulties distinguishing between the concepts of energy and power. The kilowatt hour is a unit of energy. It is not a unit of power. I know it has a kilowatt in there, which is a unit of power, but look at it. It is kilowatts times hour, or power times time. I say again, the kilowatt hour is a unit of energy. It is not a unit of power. If you don't believe me, unwrap each piece of the kilowatt hour one by one and prove it to yourself. If 1K equals 1,000, 1 kilowatt hour equals 1,000 watt hours. If 1 watt equals 1 joule per second, 1 watt hour equals 1,000 joules per second times 1 hour. If 1 hour equals 60 minutes and 1 minute equals 60 seconds, 1 kilowatt hour is 1,000 joules per second times 3,600 seconds, or 3,600,000 joules. In summary, the kilowatt hour is a unit of energy. It is a unit of power, the kilowatt, times a unit of time, the hour. Energy is power times time. The simplicity of expressing energy in units of kilowatt hours cannot be overstated. Consider a 4 kilowatt solar array being exposed to peak sunlight for a period of 4 hours. How much energy does this solar array produce in units of kilowatt hours? Energy is power times time. Rather than converting hours to seconds as we did when calculating energy using units of joules, we simply multiply the power in units of kilowatts times the time in units of hours. 4 kilowatts times 4 hours yields 16 kilowatt hours. It really is that easy. If you wanted to go to the trouble, which I have no idea why you would, you could convert this to joules, where 1 kilowatt hour equals 3.6 megajoules, and 16 kilowatt hours would equal 57.6 megajoules. You'll note calculating energy in units of kilowatt hours is astoundingly easy. Oftentimes the wattage or power of a particular device is directly specified on a device's nameplate. All you need to do to determine the energy use of a particular device is the number of hours you plan on using it. For example, consider an 800 watt air conditioner. To calculate the daily energy consumption of this air conditioner, simply multiply the wattage rating by the number of hours you use it every day. An 800 watt air conditioner used for 8 hours a day uses 800 times 8, or 6,400 watt hours of energy, or 6.4 kilowatt hours of energy. If, however, you left the 800 watt air conditioner on all day, or 24 hours, you'd be billed for 800 times 24, or 19,200 watt hours, or 19.2 kilowatt hours of energy. Consider a 100 watt incandescent bulb used for 8 hours a day. This bulb uses 100 times 8, or 800 watt hours of energy, or 0.8 kilowatt hours of energy. If you were lazy and left it on all day, or for 24 hours, you'd be billed for 100 watts times 24 hours, or 2,400 watt hours, or 2.4 kilowatt hours of energy. Consider a more efficient 20 watt LED light bulb used for 8 hours a day. This bulb would use 20 watts times 8 hours, or 160 watt hours of energy, or 0.16 kilowatt hours of energy. If you left it on all day, or for 24 hours, you'd be billed for 20 watts times 24 hours, or 480 watt hours, or 0.48 kilowatt hours of energy. Compare and contrast these last two examples. The 100 watt incandescent bulb used 5 times as much energy as the 20 watt LED light bulb, even though they operated for the same length of time. It makes sense. More power times the same time necessitates more energy, even though they are producing the same functional product, namely light of a given intensity. Be aware that I am not so naive to suggest that an LED will be sufficient for all tasks requiring light of a certain quality. Let's say painting a picture or some alone time with your imaginary girlfriend, but I am confident enough to say that if you simply require light in its most basic form, let's say task lighting in a factory, or to light up your front steps so you don't bust your ass falling down them, you'd be foolish to use an incandescent bulb to do so, principally because of the long-term energy costs. Additionally, compare and contrast the usage patterns. Any appliance, regardless of type, used for 24 hours a day necessitates more energy than an identical device used for only 8 hours a day. It makes sense. Same power, more time, necessitates more energy. This explains why it's a good economic practice to 1. Use efficient devices, i.e. devices that accomplish the same task using less power, and 2. Use these devices only when it's necessary, i.e. don't leave a light on if you don't need it. When you get right down to it, energy is money. The more energy you use, the more you pay. Nationally, price per kilowatt hour of energy varies depending upon your location, from a low of around 8 cents per kilowatt hour in regions of the Pacific Northwest to a high of around 35 cents per kilowatt hour in Hawaii, with a national average of around 12 cents per kilowatt hour at the time of this recording. An average house might consume around 30 kilowatt hours of energy daily, although daily energy consumption patterns vary widely, from the 7-bedroom McMansions of Salt Lake City chugging 100 kilowatt hours a day, whereas an efficient, well-designed modern house with a reasonable number of ecologically and economically conscious people might consume only 10 kilowatt hours. Also, if you're in a region characterized by cold winters and temperate summers like Maine or Wisconsin, you might expect larger daily energy consumption in the winter and less in the summer. Conversely, if you're in a region characterized by extremely hot summers and temperate winters like Arizona or Southern Cali, you might expect larger daily energy consumption in the summer and less in the winter. Let's just go with this average daily energy consumption of 30 kilowatt hours per day. Given this average price per kilowatt hour and the average amount of kilowatt hours used per day, it's easy to determine the average cost of energy per day. 12 cents per kilowatt hour times 30 kilowatt hours per day yields an average daily cost of $3.60 and an annual cost of $360 times $365, or $1,314 per year. Given this average daily energy consumption, let's now take a look at the average power consumption of a typical home. If power is energy over time, you might be tempted to think that a house would steadily draw 30 kilowatt hours divided by 24 hours, or 1.25 kilowatts, but you'd be absolutely wrong. Some periods of a day necessitate massive consumption of power. For example, in the morning when everyone's waking up, taking a shower, cooking breakfast, and getting ready for the day. This brief period of high power consumption is followed by a longer period of lower power consumption when everyone's at work or school. This period is then followed by another burst of high power consumption when everyone gets home and air conditioners, stoves, washers, and dryers start chugging power in massive quantities. Finally, as the day draws to a close and the occupants of the house go to sleep, only the water heater and refrigerator continue to draw power. Instantaneous power demand peaks and valleys, yet we can say there exists some average power demand, which happens to be around 1.25 kilowatts, such that over the course of a 24-hour period, the house ultimately consumes 30 kilowatt hours of energy. Those of you with a calculus background will realize that the energy is the integral, or area under the power curve, i.e. power times time. The instantaneous power curve can be a little tricky to calculate, so that's why the average is used. If you squint your eyes just right, you note the overrepresented areas in the early morning and late evening are counterbalanced by the underrepresentation of morning and afternoon. If you multiply the average power figure of 1.25 kilowatts by 24 hours, you realize the energy or area under the power curve is 1.25 times 24 or 30 kilowatt hours. Don't get too stressed about the details of this particular example just yet, but rather think on the larger point I'm trying to make. Power is instantaneous, whereas energy is consumed over time. Power is the instantaneous rate of change of energy, whereas energy is power consumed over time. Let's try an illustrated example of this concept, focusing in on a single household appliance. Consider a water heater that over the course of 1 year, or 365 days, is known to consume 4,380 kilowatt hours of energy. Given a price of 12 cents per kilowatt hour, what's the annual cost of using this water heater? Additionally, what's the average power consumption of this water heater? Calculating the annual cost is easy. 4,380 kilowatt hours times 12 cents per kilowatt hour yields an annual cost of $525.60. Average power should be easy too. Power is energy over time. 1 year is 365 days, 1 day is 24 hours, so 1 year is 8,760 hours. 4,380 kilowatt hours over 8,060 hours yields a power rating of 0.5 kilowatts, or more appropriately, 500 watts. You might reasonably think a water heater continuously, steadily draws 500 watts of power and could be powered by a 500 watt generator. This, however, is an average power figure only and totally misrepresents how an actual water heater works. Water heaters don't heat water continuously, but rather in bursts. As a simplified explanation, if water in the tank falls below a certain low value, the heater is applied at full blast until water in the tank has risen above a certain high value, after which the heater is completely turned off and the tank's insulation and thermal inertia of the water temporarily hold it inside a specified range. The result is a periodic full-on, full-off, bang-bang style control that only on average consumes 500 watts. In reality, we might expect a water heater to briefly consume massive amounts of power during the heat phase and then simply turn off during the rest phase until the temperature in the tank falls below the reset value. Obviously, water usage patterns would influence this periodic cycling. As a simplified illustration of this process, let's say a 4 kilowatt water heater operates on a 12.5% duty cycle, where for 12.5% of 60 minutes, or 7.5 minutes, the 4 kilowatt heater runs at full blast, and the remaining 87.5% of 60 minutes, or 52.5 minutes, the heater is completely off. What you'd experience over the day is regular bursts of 4 kilowatt power demand followed by an idle state. If you summate the on times for a 24-hour day, i.e. 24 times 7.5 minutes, or 180 minutes, or 3 hours, it means a 4 kilowatt device has been used for a total of 3 hours for a daily consumption of 4 kilowatts times 3 hours, or 12 kilowatt hours. If the water heater did this every day for 365 days, it would consume 365 times 12 kilowatt hours, or 4,380 kilowatt hours of energy annually. Additionally, you'd need at minimum a 4 kilowatt generator to power this water heater when it was on, that generator only working 12.5% of the time, and the other time it would sit idle. Again, those of you with a calculus background will realize energy is the area under the power curve. Rather than using the instantaneous periodic power bursts, however, it's perhaps easier to simply use the average power figure of 500 watts over the 24-hour period, which yields 12 kilowatt hours of energy per day. Moving on. Returning to our discussion of units employed when quantifying energy, the kilowatt hour makes a handy unit for most small-scale residential applications. However, if the application is smaller in nature, like a portable electronics device or sometimes batteries, you might alternatively see units of energy represented in watt seconds or watt hours. The watt second is simply a stupid way of writing a joule, because 1 watt times 1 second is 1 joule per second times a second, which yields joules. And a watt hour is a larger packet of joules. If 1 hour equals 3,600 seconds, a watt hour is 3,600 joules, or more appropriately, 3.6 kilojoules. For example, consider a storage battery known to have an energy capacity of 600 watt-hours. Theoretically, this battery could power a 600 watt device for 1 full hour, a 300 watt device for 2 hours, or a 1.2 kilowatt device for 30 minutes, or any other combination of power and time that ultimately yields a product of 600 watt-hours of energy. This, by the way, is theoretical capacity only and isn't entirely true, especially for high power demands. As we demonstrated, a AAA battery is ordinarily limited to an extremely slow rate of energy transfer per unit time, i.e. low power, and can't be expected to deliver a high power burst, as would a bullet. I suppose you could throw a battery at an aggressor's head, but I suspect that might only make them mad. We'll examine battery performance characteristics in greater details in later lectures. If the application is considerably larger, for example the daily and annual energy output of a large generation facility, you'll sometimes see figures in the megawatt-hour or gigawatt-hour range. Given your understanding of engineering prefixes, you will note that 1,000 watt-hours equals 1 kilowatt-hour. 1,000 kilowatt-hours equals 1 megawatt-hour. And finally, 1,000 megawatt-hours equals 1 gigawatt-hour. Consider a single 50 megawatt turbine inside a larger hydroelectric dam that runs at full capacity for 24 hours. How much energy does this turbine produce in one day? Energy is power times time. 50 megawatts times 24 hours yields 1,200 megawatt hours, or more appropriately, 1.2 gigawatt hours. If you wanted to put this in terms of kilowatt hours, this would be equal to 1,200,000 kilowatt hours. Consider a 2 megawatt wind turbine that runs at full capacity for only 8 hours a day. How much energy does it produce? Energy is power times time. 2 megawatts times 8 hours yields 16 megawatt hours, which if you want to put it in terms of kilowatt hours would equal 16,000 kilowatt hours. If you were to sell each kilowatt hour at a wholesale price of 5 cents per kilowatt hour, this means the turbine would produce 16,000 kilowatt hours times 5 cents per kilowatt hour, or $800. Meaning the turbine is effectively generating $100 an hour every hour it's in full production. No wonder such a high priority is placed on the efficient operation, maintenance, and timely repair of these machines. Of the questions I'm frequently asked about wind turbines: why are they so big? Why are they so tall? Why are they painted white? How many houses can a turbine power? I think the last one deserves some comment in this particular lecture. The average dunderpate bebopping down the street does not understand the difference between energy and power, and often uses these two concepts interchangeably. You, however, understand the difference. To make this a solvable problem, let's assume the following. We're using a 2 megawatt wind turbine that operates at full capacity for 8 hours a day. As we demonstrated, it would produce 16,000 kilowatt hours per day. The average daily energy consumption of a typical house is 30 kilowatt hours. And finally, each house does in fact steadily consume a flat rate power figure of 1.25 kilowatts. We know this last point isn't true because of our earlier discussions about instantaneous power demand at particular points in a day. However, let's just say the instantaneous demands of all the houses we're really considering does average out to a steady state draw of 1.25 kilowatts each. For example, not everybody's popping a load of wet clothes in a dryer, vacuuming the floor, and making a smoothie at the same time, but rather these events occur out of sync with one another such that it makes it appear as if each house draws an average 1.25 kilowatts of power. Given the original phrasing of this question, let's answer this question. How many houses can a 2 megawatt turbine power, given an average power consumption of 1.25 kilowatts each? This 2 megawatt turbine could theoretically power 2 megawatts, or 2,000 kilowatts, divided by 1.25 kilowatts per house, or 1,600 houses. Or can it? You'll note a major flaw in this assumption. Notably, this community would only be powered when the wind was blowing, meaning for the remaining 16 hours of the day when the turbine was not operating, the houses would be dark. This is to suggest that in order to continuously and reliably power this community on a 24-hour basis, a mix of energy sources like wind, water, solar, coal-fired power plants, and natural gas turbines need to work together. Not only are renewable resources like wind and solar intermittent in nature, they're also unschedulable. Intermittent and unschedulable, by the way, doesn't mean unpredictable. For example, If this community knew the wind forecast in advance, it could turn off the gas turbines and turn on the wind turbine when it was windy, and turn on the gas turbine and turn off the wind turbine when it wasn't. What's the advantage of this mixed approach? Easy. You're not burning expensive gas when the free wind is blowing. Let's answer this question from a different perspective, that of energy. Let me rephrase the question ever so slightly. How many houses' daily energy needs can a 2 megawatt turbine operating at full capacity for 8 hours satisfy, given each house consumes 30 kilowatt hours of energy every day? As we demonstrated, a 2 megawatt turbine operating at full capacity for 8 hours produces 16,000 kilowatt hours. Given each house consumes 30 kilowatt hours each day, this means this turbine can satisfy the daily energy needs of 16,000 divided by 30, or roughly 533 houses. Or does it? The problem again is matching the instantaneous power requirements of a house with the instantaneous power output of the turbine. The turbine produces way more power than the instantaneous needs of 533 houses for 8 hours, and then just goes dark when the wind stops. There's a workable solution to this problem too. Consider letting the wind turbine operate intermittently throughout the day and dump excess overproduction into a battery bank to be withdrawn when the wind dies. What's the advantage of this approach? Easy. You're not burning any gas at all. Other techniques that could allow the transition to an all-renewable grid might be the grid itself. Consider several communities, each consisting of 533 houses and a 2 megawatt wind turbine linked to each other via a transmission grid. Granted, it may not be windy in regions A and C, but in region C where it is windy, the output of this turbine can be directed to A, B, and C, matching the instantaneous power output of the turbine with the instantaneous power demands for all three communities. When weather patterns shift and it's windy in region A and not in B and C, the output of this community's turbine is directed to A, B, and C. Add to this transmission scheme localized battery storage in regions A, B, and C. When it's windy in 2 or more regions, any excess power is stored in these battery banks to account for the inevitable day when the wind refuses to blow in any of these regions. Keep in mind, energy storage needn't be limited to electrochemical means as in batteries, but can also take the form of pumped hydro storage, where in the event of excess power production, water is pumped uphill, and in the event of need, it's allowed to run downhill and turn a hydroelectric turbine. Add to the simplistic wind generation scheme additional supporting renewable resources like solar, biofuels, and geothermal. This scheme is not as far-fetched as you might think. We have the technology. We have solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and a transmission grid. To make this a reality, we need political will and economic muscle to overcome the significant technical challenges this presents. This will not be easy, nor inexpensive by any measure. Intermittent and unschedulable renewable resources like solar and wind necessitate a sufficiently large population of distributed generation sites. Batteries and reservoirs must be constructed at sufficient scale, and the transmission grid needs to be upgraded to handle this level of coordination. Vocal detractors are quick to point out the complexity and costs of such a future. Listen, I never said it was going to be cheap and easy. In fact, I'm telling you up front, the switch to renewables will be the most expensive and most complicated leap we've ever made. However, the future of business as usual is horrifying to consider. Think of a world with more and more and more people and less resources. You do the math. I don't mean to end this lecture on a down note, but I do want to emphasize that society needs energy to function. All forms of energy extraction come at a price. The way I see it, we can pay this cost via 2 radically different approaches. 1, the hard and dirty way, fighting increasingly frequent conflicts to ensure our continued access to limited petroleum supplies. Or 2, the soft and clean way, make our own energy inside our own communities using abundant renewable resources. My intention in publishing these lectures is to give you the skills necessary to contribute towards solving a complex challenge that has lasting implications for our nation's future. In conclusion, this lecture examined energy and power on an introductory level. We learned power is energy per unit time, and energy is power times time. We introduced units used to measure energy, namely the joule and the kilowatt hour, and learned to convert power measurements expressed in units of horsepower and watts. Remember to review these concepts as often as you need to really drive it home. Imagine how well lab will go if you know what you're doing. Thank you very much for your attention and interest, and we'll see you again during the next lecture of our series. Remember to tell your Lazy Lab partner about this resource, and be sure to check out the Big Bad Tech channel for additional resources and updates.